Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild Encounter compilation, Grimm Encounters 2, compiled and designed by JVC Parry for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shout out to my platinum patrons Andrew, Brian, Richard, and Joe, and gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, and Pretty Boy and Yuma. Thank you all so much for your support. So switch on over, take a look at Grimm Encounters. So, whether or not you've actually read Grimm's fairy tales, you have heard of them. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you probably know of them. Disney has built an empire upon Grimm's fairy tale. And that's not to be cynical. I really like, Disney movies and was certainly raised on them. But literally every Disney princess, and just a lot of classic tales like Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, Snow White, all these things that are so ingrained in our folklore can be traced back to Grimm's fairy tales. So I think that's a really fun thing to pull from and then apply to Dungeons and Dragons. So what this does is, and I'm not familiar with the first Grimm Encounters, this is just solely based on the sequel, Grimm Encounters 2, is it pulls together 12 encounters from 6 different writers, all of whom should be pretty well known on the DM's Guild, if you spend any time on there recognizing some of the names and personalities, to create a dozen encounters that are pulled specifically from certain fairy tales. And from what I can tell, they are not the most well-known sources, which is kind of good and bad. Like, you're not going to see, in other words, a D&D version of Red Riding Hood, which I was kind of looking forward to in a way, just because I think there could be some fun twists on that. But on the other hand, if your players are, something like that, like, you instantly know kind of what's happening. But I do think that there's an argument to be made where using familiar tropes and settings within a framework of D&D can be a really effective tool, because then your players instantly go, okay, I know what this is, I know how these characters react, now I can be the agent of change and be the one to either play along or fuck things up or provide the twist or something else, and that's a cool spotlight. While also, you're putting your character in already an unfamiliar world, which is a fantasy setting. I mean, I guess some people are hardcore into various fantasy settings and can maybe relate to that kind of stuff. But, if you use something that's a classic fairy tale setup, then you can provide that twist. Instead, what this does is kind of use a lot of maybe lesser known ones, certainly ones that haven't been, like, directly Disney-fied and that kind of thing. But still uses a lot of those same themes. So you're going to see evil witches. You're going to see curses, polymorphed animals that are, like nobles who have been transformed, very much like the Beast and Beauty and the Beast kind of a thing, where that one has, a witch and a curse and these are all very much things that happen in a lot of these fairy tales. So it does create some overlapping themes, but with the caveat that, like, that's kind of what Grimm's fairy tales are in a way, is that they include those same things, those same storytelling elements. Some of them work better than others. I'm going to go through, I'm not going to nitpick every single one of them because there's a lot here. There's a dozen of them. I will go through kind of the ones I like and the ones I don't like, as well as just kind of how it's set up and organized. But overall, I'm quite satisfied with what you get here, with a few caveats. So, Grimm Encounters 2, Grimm Boogaloo. One thing I really like that it does, and I mentioned this in a previous compilation that I reviewed, I believe it was Storm King's Barrows, that was also one that used a lot of different authors' works to create different, in that one it was dungeons, or really mini adventures. This one is really encounters, which encounters are anywhere from like 1 to 5 pages, and they're designed to be played out within a session. So, one shot. But to me, an encounter is even more bare bones than a one-shot. Like, literally can be just an encounter or a series of encounters that are kind of tied together with a bit of a story. So I even hesitate to use the word one-shot, which is why I've been saying encounter, not one-shot, because I really feel like these are even lighter than that, which is good. I feel like there's certainly a market for one shots, there's a market for mini dungeons, and there's a market for just a series of encounters. And I feel like this is some of them skirt the line. They're a little more involved than others, and I don't necessarily think that's for the better. But I do like that this is organized to give you a little brief blurb about each author. It's something I really like that Storm King's Barrows did. Um, that way, if you just like a particular author's writing style or their content, you can go back to this section and kind of look up in a brief blurb. Obviously, nowadays on the internet, you can just type the name in DM's Guild, whatever, and find their stuff. But it's nice to get a little bit of a thing, especially written from that author, which is a nice perspective. So most of them are Tier 1 and Tier 2. Now, tiers are divided up, I believe, into every 5 levels is considered a different tier, which is a different overall challenge rating for content. Now, that's very difficult in some cases. Like, there's a world of difference between a level 1 player character and a level 3 player character. So tier 1 is especially tricky in balancing. And again, in a level like 5 character. And it's level, 5 to 9. Is that how it works? 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. No, because I'm running out of tiers. Maybe it's 1 to 5. In any case, I'm not a fan of I wish it was more specifically, here's the levels. Like, the tier is fine. It gives you a generic kind of overarching, like, here's kind of where we think the ballpark is difficulty-wise, but, and as I said, with Tier 1 especially, it can be very, very tricky. And some of them that are more combat-focused do have that adjustable difficulty, which is very, very nice to have. And it's one of the more difficult things to do in D&D is try to balance out the content, and it's something that, as a DM, you really have to be the one to be the ultimate arbiter of, like, oh shit, this is going really badly, I need to scale back, or my particular party has either less players, or maybe they're less combat inclined, or maybe they're more combat inclined. Maybe everybody's min-maxed, and I just have that kind of murder hobo players that really want to be able to, get the most out of their players. They know how to build things to maximize their damage output and create a balanced party, and maybe you want the higher end. So that part's fine. I do wish I had more specific level ranges instead of just the tiers. That's a minor quibble. I do like the way it's organized, though. You've got each one, get the mouse on the screen, it has the tale it's based on, which is really cool, as well as the type, which is divided up, I think, into combat, roleplay, and exploration. I think are the 3 types that you can have, and a lot of them obviously are combat and something else. I mean, let's face it, D&D, like, most of the tools there are built for combat, but that doesn't mean you can't have nice little role-playing scenarios that have a lot of either outside of the box, like just role-playing something, or just a bunch of skill checks. I think that's definitely room for that, and I'm glad they're included here. As I mentioned with the tiers, the tier value. This is the only one that's a tier 3. Every single other one is a tier 1 or tier 2, which is probably where the majority of D&D content lies. I've mentioned this time and again, but even with the official D&D published adventures, like, that's the same thing. Like, you always start at level 1, even though the adventure might not start to level 3, and it's a solidly, like, tier 1, tier 2 adventure, and then maybe towards the end it gets up to, like, tier 3, and that's about it. I've never seen hardly any content for actual tier 4, which at that point, your players are like demigods, and it's really fucking hard to do anything that's not already baked into whatever the DM's campaign is. I really like this single sentence you get at the top. So there's something called an elevator pitch, which is, I think that's a Hollywood term, but essentially, I think Spielberg once said this, you should be able to explain your entire story in a single sentence. If you can't, then you don't have a good handle on what you're trying to say or do or tell. And that's overly simplified, ironically. But I like that here, because in a single sentence you get basically like the lead. It's the header. It's the, whatever terminology you want to use. So for Ball and a Bird in a Bowl, it's after discovering a cursed woman in the woods, the party agrees to help her dispel the affliction by recovering a crystal ball from a bizarre beast. That nicely explains what the hell is going on in all of these situations. For beyond the realms of madness, can the party help a deranged father cursed by the ghosts of his deceased family? I like all of these a lot. And in case you need more explanation, there's a premise paragraph that literally just explains everything that's going on in that encounter. So it's a very easy, at-a-glance tool for DMs to be able to look at that and say, like, okay, do I like this idea or do I not? If I do, then I can read the rest of it. Presumably you bought it, you're hopefully reading the whole thing anyway. But just you get a feel for it like instantly out of the gate without having to dive in there and figure out what's going on. So it's organized very very well. These are alphabetically and not by CR. As I said, this first one is actually the highest one at a tier 3. It involves saving a Medusa, who is one of 3 sisters. I just want to read the description because I think this one's hilarious. Um, 2 enormous hill giants are swinging their tree trunk clubs at a snake-haired woman who deftly dives out of the way of the blows. You watch and notice that she is trying to recover a woolen hat from one of the giants, while don't say whilst. That's terrible. I don't like it. Simultaneously trying to spill a glass bowl of water that she has grasped tightly to her chest. And there's a goldfish in the bowl of water, and there's a little finch flying around her. And there's a small, and it mentions that in the next paragraph. They can see that with a perception check. That's just a funny visual, like this Medusa, like ducking out of the way of these hills. Like that's a great thing to just stumble upon as an encounter, and it's very like evocative. And you can end up helping her, and you have to defeat the hill giants, and then you have to take on her quest, which involves her mother had cursed them. Again, mothers, witches, all this stuff is very thematic with Grimm's fairy tales. You have to defeat a Gorgon, which then turns into a bird, rips out of it like Xenomorph style, which you then have to fight that. This is just literally a series of fights. That's all it basically boils down to in the end. But it's a fun series. Oh my gosh, my wife's goal is to call during every one of my reviews. It's a really fun series of battles with at least some reasoning behind it, and that's fine. Like some of them can just be a series of battles. Like I have no problem with that whatsoever. 2 of them in here are a little much for me. Both of them written by Ken Carcas, and both of them based, I guess, on the same tale, How Some Children Played at Slaughtering, which sounds like it'd be more at home in like a Stephen King novel, whereas the rest of these are more like, and I get, obviously the Disneyfication made all of these way more like, hey, talking animals and we're dancing and singing, and that's, Grimm's fairy tales are actually pretty fucking dark a lot of the times, like when you look at what all these things are based on. But this one is really fucking dark. Like these 2 together, the other one even more so that's listed later on, involve like children killing each other and ghosts and hauntings and cruelty. And again, I get that this shit is dark, but like compared to the others, which is more like adventure-y, and I'm not saying horror has no place in D&D. It absolutely does. You can effectively do horror in D&D 100%. Even if your players aren't into horror, there are like horror elements you can infuse in there pretty well. But boy, when you have children brutally killing each other, I don't know. I'm no prude, but that kind of upset me in a bad way. Now, I do like that there is literally a content warning at the beginning. I'm kind of blocking it right now. There we go. I've never actually seen this in any DM's Guild thing. I've like a trigger warning basically, that says includes suicide, infanticide, and animal cruelty. If anyone at your table is likely to be distressed, please do not run the encounters. That's a good note to have in there. So, in other words, the designer is acknowledging the fact that there is some content in here that is going to be, eyebrow raising, basically. And this one I did find very eyebrow raising. It just felt a bit much compared to the others, I guess. When reading all of them, when I started out reading, I was like, okay, this one's really horrific and nasty. And then I kind of read the rest of them, and then I read the second one, and I was like, yeah, these 2 just really stand out as being. I get that they're all based on the Grimm's tales, but they just feel particularly like evil and nasty. This one really plays out like a horror movie. Like you go to this farm and you're trying to help this farmer who's been, everybody thinks he killed his family, and it turns out like his family just basically killed themselves / each other in really horrible ways, to where you're basically just going around watching cutscenes of these ghosts like killing each other, and then at some point you can intervene and then the ghosts attack you. It's like you're sitting in a haunted mansion ride, just kind of watching these things unfold. So I can't say I'm a big fan of that one. It's also really long. Kind of stretches the idea of what an encounter is. So not quite a big fan of that one. Bounine Feathers is a really, really simple one based on the 7 Ravens, where this sister has to try to lift the curse of her brothers. It's literally just a one fight encounter. It's like almost a single page. You can see most of the second page is a picture here. Pretty good art throughout. But I like the twist that it's a like what do you call it? Survival scenario where you have to defend like a point. In this case, you have to defend a person, and there's a cup. She had to actually cut off her ring finger, and you have to just defend her for. actually don't know how long it is, but this assassin comes with the 7 giant ravens, and the caveat here is that she doesn't want you to hurt the ravens, or at least not kill them. And meanwhile, they're like coming after you. So I think that's an interesting scenario where you have to like try to use more like defensive magic, or just try to take out that assassin, or do something there to turn it into a little bit of a challenge. Which I like. That to me is a good example of an encounter. Like it's just one thing that happens, but it's got that Grimm fairy tale theme, and it's got enough of a little bit of a interest to the, an added layer to the combat. In this case, you having to not kill the giant ravens, that makes it more interesting, but it still doesn't overstate its welcome and be pages and pages of cutscenes. The Elves the Shoemaker is one of my favorite ones in here. This is a very classic tale. The elves, based on the Elves and the Shoemaker. This one, the twist is great, and a great example of how you can really have fun with applying Grimm's fairy tales to D&D. In that, it turns out beneath the cobbler's house is a passage to the Underdark, where a raiding party of drow have partnered with the cobbler, I think it's a gnome named Barnabas Cobblebottom, and in return for him getting a lot of special material to make his shoes, he captures people and obviously helps the drow just work out of his home, and the drow are all about capturing people for slaves to bring back into the Underdark. So it's a nice little investigation, mostly. What is it categorized as? Exploration and combat. Okay. As the parties have to kind of investigate what's going on, and it leads them to Barnabas's brilliant boutique, and it basically just ends in a battle with a bunch of drow. I think it's okay. It is tier 2, so you've got just a bunch of drow right there. I think that's the only really combat sequence, which again, that's a nice encounter. Like, yes, this is lengthy, a lot of writing here, but it's all like you kind of just investigating like how these people are disappearing, and you're going around the town trying to figure out what's going on, and you're talking to folks. And then when you actually find the thing, it just ends up in one battle, and then that's it. That to me feels like, again, this is that good kind of Adventurers League length, where it's basically a one-shot, but even here it might even be less than a one-shot. Like it's just, you can do all of this within a session, which that's a big thumbs up. And I just think that's a funny way of kind of remixing that classic Elves and the Shoemaker story. Fox and the Fool I didn't really like much. It had a talking animal, which is pretty classic. You're having to just help this hapless dude, and it's a bunch of kind of skill checks. It's okay. The Girl and the Witch which one is that? Oh, the Goose Girl. Okay, that was a weird one too. It's all role-playing, so it's basically just talking to this witch, which you can just fight her in the end if you want to. It's the girl who's cursed to kind of look ugly most of the time, except under the moonlight. This one I actually heard when I was a kid for some reason. We had somebody come and like tell us a bunch of ghost stories, and this was one of them. I don't know why. It's kind of horrible that like a horror story is like a girl that looks ugly sometimes. That's pretty messed up. But I like that some of these are basically just like dialogue and role play, although you can certainly fight the witch if you want to. And I believe this one has a really nice, scroll down a bit, way to adjust the difficulty, because I think it's tier 1, but you can actually adjust it, just literally change what the hag is, and it tells you. And again, I like the way this references the parentheses where you can find it. And I get that, at the end of the document there is a list of where all these creatures are and where you can find them. But I like to see that in the document so that I can quickly see at a glance, at least if something is an original creature that's in the appendix, or if it's just something like I missed somewhere. Like I'm not super familiar with Volos as much as the monster manual. And this one does, I think, split the difference pretty well, in that if something is a unique monster, then it does say, at least the first time it's used, it has that parentheses in there. It says Appendix A or whatever is used here. Whereas otherwise it's just bolded, and then there's a list at the end that says kind of where you can find it, which that's fine. The Glass Mountain is, I think, my favorite out of them all. This one really feels like Wizard of Oz to me in a really fun way. It's got all the classic tropes. It's got the witch. It's got the cursed animal who was a person, and she was turned into a raven. A lot of ravens in Grimm's fairy tales. And you get teleported to a dream world where you have to kind of just do a series of challenges. I love the one where it's the 3 guys kind of arguing. Each one has an item that they think is going to work to get them there, and you kind of have to manipulate them in order to manipulate their items. And it even says solution. There are many possible solutions. The characters can attempt persuasion checks to either drink from this endless jug of wine that the players are given, to steal their items. They could steal the one with the stick to beat the others. They could take the invisible potion, and whatever they have to do, they have to get this figurine of a lizard that lets them crawl up. I love all that. It's really great. It's that kind of open-ended thing that I think a lot of players like sit forward in their chair and really engage with, because they're given this very clear scenario with multiple options on how to approach, and it's just a fun like dialogue exchange. And honestly, they can make it through this entire adventure with no combat whatsoever. Although, and it is categorized as roleplay, they could also fight things. I mean, they can fight these three guys are veterans. They can fight this giant instead of just trying to help him. They can't. Although if they try to fight at the end, it blows up in their face. They're supposed to be doing a specific task. But I really like that adventure, and I think it evokes that kind of nice Wizard of Oz. Like we go to a land and there's fantastical, or Alice in Wonderland, whatever. But a very, very, very like brief, short, one-shot encounter version of that. So it's not like this full, campaign in Wonderland or Narnia or whatever. It's just a very brief like series of those kind of two events. So Glass Mountain is probably my favorite of the bunch. Really cool. The Old Hag and the Ring is very, very simple. This is the only map we get in the entire adventure. That's definitely going to be a con at the end. I like my maps. I like good maps, but I like maps in general. This one at least has one map here, although I don't think it's a separate player handout. A lot of these could have used, not huge maps, and I get that. And some of these are very much more like roleplay roleplay-y, to where you wouldn't almost necessarily need maps, but others are just, they could have used like some kind of map in there would have been nice for a lot of these adventures. This one does have one. It's not even necessary, frankly. It's just really the one encounter. And this is another. This time it's a person transformed into a tree instead of an animal, but same kind of thing. Like a witch has cursed him, and you have to go save him from the witch. This one has a twist in that he actually is kind of a shithead. He went to the witch to get his brother killed, and the witch kind of cursed him. So you find out this information, then you can decide to either save him or, tell him to piss off, which could create an enemy further down the road, I guess, although he's still a fucking tree. The Owl is a very straightforward. This one doesn't even sound Grimm's Fairy Tale-ish, but it says it's based on one, where just a giant owl has taken up a nest in a villager's barn, and she has had babies, and it's kind of, the players have to just deal with her. They can either kill her, Monster Hunter style, or try to reason with her, because apparently she has a intelligence score and she can be reasoned with. She just speaks common, I guess. I forget where it shows her. I guess her stats are at the end. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward, but I guess could be interesting if you want to kind of leave the twist that the players could talk to her. Although I think they have to kill her or some of her babies, the giant owlets, on the way there. Town Musicians of Waterdeep has kind of a spooky start to it, and the whole thing is kind of spooky, really. This is one that's kind of gruesome without, I think, being too overly like just horrifying and nasty. And that's these four animals that have been awakened, so they're turned sentient basically, but they can't speak at all, and they're just kind of hanging out in this weird cottage with a pile of gold. And of course, if the players touch the gold, and all player characters will, I would think, they freak out and they mold into one big super creature. Which reminds me, I've got a young kid, and so we read the Room on the Broom story, and there's a part in Room on the Broom where these animals that she's been collecting on the broom kind of fall into a mud pit, and they kind of inadvertently pretend to be this giant monster of different heads and things, and they scare off this dragon terrorizing the witch. Which is exactly what fucking happens here. Like, it's, well, not exactly, but these animals are morphed into each other, kind of forming this horrifying gestalt-like creature. And it's a flesh golem with a unique multi-attack of 4 attacks. Donkey Kick, Dog Bite, Cat Claws, and Rooster Beak, which is really quite interesting. And otherwise, it's just a simple fight. Like, they defeat this creature, and then they can presumably take the gold after that. So it's just that. I mean, that one's kind of horrifying in that these creatures kind of form together and fight it, but it's just a one battle. And again, that's a good example of just a very simple encounter without being too in depth. Because again, I think there's a difference between like a one shot and a mini adventure and just an encounter. And I feel like that one again does a very good just kind of one encounter. The Trial of Little Franticer Finn is the one that I was really like, okay, this is the other one from the How Some Children Played at Slaughtering. It's a doppelganger has kidnapped a child and is now pretending to be that child and is essentially just killing other children and then just having fun with it, and it's fucking brutal and nasty and horrifying, and I can't say I'm a big fan of that. I get there's people that like this kind of content. I'm not gonna do any judgment or anything on that. It just feels a little much for me. I was not a fan. This one is also it's overly written. I feel like there's a lot in here, and a lot of this is because the adventure only works if the players know to like they have to arrest somebody and then go through the trial motion instead of just murdering. And I think one thing the author does do is realize that most players aren't going to arrest people. Most players just fucking kill people. You know, rules be damned. And this one really says like, no, you have to, like, there's a whole judicial system heading here where it's like you have to explain to your players like, here's how things, because in order for this adventure to work, they have to basically be able to capture that doppelganger child rather than kill them. And I think if you ever have to think like, okay, the adventure only works if this, then I think you've kind of written yourself into a corner. So I don't think it works terribly well. And I just don't like there's a scene they come across where like the child is literally just disembowels another child, and I get that it's a doppelganger, but fuck, that is nasty and awful. No, thank you. I'm not doing that. 2 Dozen Devils, not much really going on here. A spurned lover is makes a pact with a demon, and these 12 demons come and hunt this other guy, and that's kind of all there is to it. Again, it's kind of overly explained a little bit with the story behind it, but I mean, it could be. I think you could flesh this one out pretty good. There might be like a twist involved, but with who's behind it. The one thing I really, really like here is that the character being attacked, Francisco, has a pet lion called Il Fato, and it's Lion Cat from Saga is what it is. Creatures within 30 feet of Il Fato who utter a lie are met by a discourteous grumble of lying from the feline arbiter. That is Lion Cat from Saga. I love it. That is a fantastic nod. I don't know if that's actually from Grimm's Fairy Tales at all, if that's where they got Lion Cat, but that is absolutely from Saga, which Saga is an awesome sci-fi comic series, absolutely fantastic from Image that I cannot recommend enough. Lion Cat is a character that is a giant hairless cat who can detect when people lie, and he literally just says lying. So I thought that was a really, really funny thing about it that made me really smile and enjoy this otherwise fairly straightforward, not quite as interesting encounter. So you can see I just went through actually all of them. More often than not, they're good. They're not all great, but I feel like they definitely sell that theme of Grimm's Fairy Tales pretty well. There is some overlapping stuff. There's a lot of witches, there's a lot of animals, but all that stuff is in Grimm's Fairy Tales, so I feel like that, it's appropriate there. There is an appendix here with some unique animals that are used, like the giant owl, that Il Fato, the giant owlets that are used that you have to kill. Not a whole lot of custom content. These ones actually get the biggest. These are the psychic phantoms that are that play. If you try to fuck with the ghosts during that one, that's otherwise pretty linear. These huge CR7 ghosts fucking come at you, or maybe it's the CR4 ones. I don't know. They're both here. But good stuff all around. There's the appendix, final appendix. Let's go through my pros and cons for Grimm Encounters 2. So pro, the encounters feature a nice variety of role-playing, story, investigation, and combat. There's just a good balance of encounters here, and the fact that they're organized very well to where it says, what the type is. It's combat if it's roleplay heavy, and the fact that there are some that are just basically role playing, or are some that are just a single combat encounter. That's fine. The fact that there are different ones there is what makes it work. So that they can't all be role playing. They can't all be just a combat scenario. But I like that there is a pretty good variety. So you've got kind of something for everyone. Pro, each encounter is very well organized, explaining the type, the CR tier, and the premise right from the start. I cannot stress how helpful that is from a DM's point of view to be able to see instantly all of this information just right here in a snapshot. That is so, so, so good to have. Pro, I just wanted to call out my two favorite ones. The Glass Mountain and the Elves the Shoemaker are particularly effective at applying the themes, the fairy tale themes to D&D while effectively telling mini stories. I just really liked those encounters. And Pro, Lion Cat. I'm a big Saga fan, so I just liked seeing that. That was hilarious. Cons, maps. There's only a single map in the entire compendium or compilation. It's a fine map, but there's no kind of separate map. There's no really separate player handouts at all either. I'm a stickler for maps. It's not as bad here. Like these, a lot of these are very, very small, just kind of one thing encounters, and it wouldn't be that hard to cobble together the map that you need. But it also goes a very, very big way in my book when I see somebody throw together a simple battle, even just one battle map per encounter. And these are not dungeons, so they're not as necessary. But it would be nice to at least have some usable battle maps for those of us that primarily play on digital tabletop stuff, like Roll20. Con, the CR tiers are provided instead of specific levels. I've seen tiers used before, and it's nice to have, but I've never seen them used in lieu of specific levels. And here they are. The only time I think is that one with which you could scale up depending on the level. But this one, I don't know, it just feels like I would have liked that more specifically stated of like, okay, is this a level 6 to 7, abouts? Is it level 8 to 9? And again, you might not be perfect in estimating this, but none of us are. Like, D&D is very, very difficult to balance in that way, and a lot of it depends on what your player makeup is like. But I would have liked to have a little more specifically stating like what the level range was, and not just the tier, I guess. Con, I'm gonna have to call out the trial of Little Fenneker Finn is overly gruesome and cruel, with a premise that's a bit too long and detailed for a single session encounter. So not only did I find it just really messed up in general, but the fact that it relies on the players like having to work within the judicial system to make it work is kind of a crutch that's not quite gonna work out too terribly long, too terribly well. Alright, final verdict for Grimm Encounters 2. If you like your witches evil and you're talking animals cursed, Grimm Encounters 2 features a nice assortment of encounters and one-shots based on a dozen classic fairy tales. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. You can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.